So the Brooklyn Nets lose in 7 games in round two to the Milwaukee Bucks. And yes, I'm making this a couple days later. I honestly was not in the right state of mind to make this the past 2 nights. So here we are this is Monday night making this video. Of course, the game happened on Saturday and it was tough. It's tough to deal with. I am still pretty sad about what happened, but it is what it is. Injuries happen. It's a part of sports. But I will say, there's one word that really sums up why it's so disappointing, and it's expectations. My expectations for the Nets, especially after the James Harden trade, was to win a championship. So my expectations as a Nets fan were up here. And when the Nets fall somewhere around here, it's like, that's tough to deal with sometimes. But when you're rooting for a team that you don't have high expectations for when they get out in the first or second round, you're like, okay, like for example, the Nets a couple years back, even last year in the bubble, they got swept by Toronto, but a couple years back, they lost in 5 games to the Sixers. I said, okay, well, we had low expectations coming into the year. They made the playoffs. They lost in 5 games, but it is what it is. Of course, I was upset, but not to this level. So when you expect your team to go out there and contend for a title and they don't get past round two, it's tough to deal with, I will say, but I do genuinely believe if the Nets were healthy, or at least had two of their stars healthy, they would have got past this round. They would have faced the Hawks in the conference finals, and I would have felt very good about that matchup, but that's just a bunch of what ifs at that point, and it's just my opinion, so it is what it is. But I give Milwaukee credit for handling their business. Yes, I feel like they kind of got away with some injury luck, but I guess they had Dante DiVincenzo out, if you want to make that comparison, but at the same time, it is what it is. But this series was absolutely wild. I will say, I know we're on the losing end of it, and it sucks, but I will say it was a crazy series. 7 games, overtime in the final game. Like, it does not get much better than that from an outsider standpoint. As a Nets fan, I'm sure as Bucks fans out there, it was very gut-wrenching. It was kind of tough to watch sometimes, and my heart was pounding through a lot of that series. And I felt very good, obviously, after the first 2 games. The Nets, win the first game relatively easy. I forget the final score. They might have won by like 10 points, 15 points, whatever it was. Game 2 was an absolute blowout. The Nets were up 49 at one point. Then Game 3 happened, and that's kind of where Joe Harris kind of turned into Alan Crabb or Torian Prince or someone along those lines and couldn't make anything. And Joe Harris had 2 or 3 really good opportunities to make a three-pointer. Actually, no. One of them was a three-pointer, maybe 2 of them. But, of course, that mid-range jumper that put them up 3 potentially late in the fourth quarter, that was the shot that will haunt us Nets fans for this year. Joe Harris misses that one. The Bucks come down. I think Drew Holiday had the layup, and the Bucks won Game 3. Then Game 4 is happening. The Nets and Bucks are close in that one. Kyrie Irving comes down and bends his ankle the wrong way. That was tough to see. I love Kyrie, so that was tough to watch. Obviously, he never came back this series. Bucks tied up at 2. So now I'm sweating. I'm like nervous as hell, and I was very down. I think that game happened on a Sunday. That Monday, I was devastated. I really did feel our season was over. I mean, it was a week later, but James Harden has this miraculous, I don't want to call it like a comeback, but just, he's ruled out. Then he's ruled doubtful, and then he's ruled questionable, and he comes back and plays on what we found out to be a grade 2 hamstring strain of 9 days of rest, I believe, which is pretty impressive, honestly. I give James Harden a lot of credit for trying to gut it out and play through it, and obviously James Harden should have been out for at least a month. He came back in a little over a week, so I give him a lot of credit, of course. He did not play his best basketball, but he gave it his all. So Game 5 happens. Now, Game 5, as a Nets fan, that's where, the magic happened. That was unbelievable. One of the better Nets games I've ever watched. Of course, Kevin Durant goes off for the 49 points, I believe. His fourth quarter was amazing. His second half was amazing. James Harden comes back. He did not have the most efficient game, but I feel he kind of lifted their spirits, lifted up the fan spirit as well. The Nets kind of felt like their season was over at that time. Then James Harden comes back and gave the Nets fans some hope, and I'm sure some of his teammates as well. So then the Nets go up 3-2, a game away from advancing to the Eastern Conference Finals. Game 6 happens in Milwaukee. I'll admit, I was not confident whatsoever they're going to win that game. I was kind of looking towards Game 7, but if they won in Game 6, I would have been very excited about that, of course. So, of course, Milwaukee wins. I'm not going to say easily because, the final score looked big, it was a big differential. But the Nets were down 4 or 5 at some points as well in that game. Of course, Joe Harris could have made a 3 in that game to make it 80-82, I believe, but he missed it, and the Bucks went on a big run after that. So, Game 7 happens, and the Nets were up 10 at one point. They were up 6 at halftime. I'm feeling all right. Of course, it's Game 7. I'm nervous the entire time. The Bucks in the final couple minutes, they go up by, I think it was like 5 points or so. So I'm starting to feel like, oh crap, the season's over. This is not good. Not feeling good whatsoever. Then Kevin Durant, one more time, just pulls a miracle for the Nets and makes this incredible turnaround jump shot that was this close from being a three-pointer and ending the Bucks season right over PJ Tucker. So yeah, his shoe size was a bit too big right there. That's unfortunate, but Kevin Durant was just ridiculous this entire series. I forgot to give Jeff Green a shout out for Game 5. He was very good in Game 5 as well. But Kevin Durant, what he did specifically in Games 5 and 7 when the Nets needed him the most, it was crazy. And I know that this is the way NBA Twitter and NBA media works, is that when a guy has a great game, we label him as the best player on the planet. It's a very recency bias type thing. But the list of the best NBA players currently right now, there's not many guys, if any, that you can put over Kevin Durant. The guy is now 32 years old, had Achilles surgery a year and a half ago, but the guy came back and looks honestly as good as he ever did, maybe even better. So Kevin Durant, give him a lot of credit for what he did. It's a shame that performance or those performances went to waste by losing this series, but not really his fault. But anyway, the Nets go up 2 in Game 7 in overtime. Bruce Brown has like a layup and puts it in, or offensive rebound layup. And then I feel like they didn't score the rest of the overtime. I know the Bucks got some nice shots from Drew Holiday, which they needed, of course, because Drew Holiday was not having a good series shooting-wise. So they get that, of course. The Bucks, they go on to win. Kevin Durant with the air ball. And you know what? If Kevin Durant was able to make another big shot, that would have been great. But at the same time, I mean, the guy was clearly out of gas. And yeah, I know KD kind of rushed the shot. There was like 4-ish seconds left when he shot that ball. He probably could have drove to the right elbow and got up a better looking shot. But it is what it is. The guy was on fire. He thought he could make it. So who am I to judge? But yeah, so that ended the Nets season, and it's tough. I mean, it was a crazy season for the Nets, honestly, because it starts out as Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant playing together for the first time. The Nets have Karis LeVert, Jared Allen, Spencer Dinwiddie. It was a different team back then. Then Spencer Dinwiddie in the second game of the season tears his ACL. Big loss. I mean, people forget how good Spencer Dinwiddie was. The guy had averaged 20 points per game last year. Like, he's a very good. He would have been the best backup point guard in the NBA this year, I think, by a good amount too. So he was definitely greatly missed. He opted out, I think, of his player option, which I saw recently. That sucks. But yeah, it was a weird year. And of course, the Nets traded for James Harden in about, 10 games into the year. If that. It was pretty early on, but I would say 10 to 15 games into the year. I don't know when it was, but it was relatively early in the season. So James Harden, there was a bunch of fat memes coming out about him. He had like his stomach tucked over his pants, and it was not looking good in Houston. But he comes to the Nets, and James Harden played unbelievably well for the Nets. He got a triple-double in his first game, and he was honestly an MVP candidate. I know that people would not have voted for him because he kind of forced his way out of Houston. It was a bad look. But James Harden, based on his impact to the Nets when he was healthy, was in the MVP running before his hamstring injury. So the Nets never really got their big three playing together, which really sucked because that was much anticipated for any Nets fan out there. If you're a basketball fan in general, maybe you hate the Nets, I get that, but I feel like a lot of people wanted to see that trio play together. I think they played 8 regular season games together. I know that once, they traded for Harden. Kyrie came out of his hiatus for 2 weeks. He started playing again. Then Kevin Durant had like this, COVID scare. He was like a close contact to somebody. He came back, hurt his hamstring. He was out for like 2 months. Then James Harden got hurt right after KD came back, or a little before maybe, I forget. But yeah, the Nets never got healthy. It was a season of a bunch of hamstring injuries. It was tough. And I don't want to be the guy to make the injury excuse, but the NBA had like a more of a compact season this year. They started later, of course. I think the NBA usually starts in late October. This year it started on Christmas, I believe, or maybe a couple days before, I forget, but sometime in late December, and they tried to cram all these games in. It was a 72-game season, I think it was, so they tried to cram a lot of games in a short amount of time. So, of course, it's going to be hard for some of these guys, especially a guy like Kevin Durant, who hadn't played for basically over a year at that point, and James Harden coming in clearly out of shape when he went to Houston. So yeah, I mean, I'm making excuses, but still, it's part of it. So where am I going with this? So yeah, it sucked that we never got to see the Nets really play together. We saw it in the Boston series. The Nets played very well for most of that series. They allowed a 50-point game to Jason Tatum. They lost game number 3, but they finished them off relatively easily. I know Jaylen Brown was out, whatever, but still, they won that series in 5 games. Then 43 seconds into the Milwaukee series, James Harden hurts his hamstring, and it's like, oh, God, here we go. But the Nets were clearly going to get by, in my opinion, with just Kyrie and Kevin Durant. Like, they were fine. They won that game 2 by a million points. They looked fine. Then Milwaukee's game 3 happened. That was a turning point of the series. I know everyone's going to look at game 7 as the deciding game, and rightfully so. But if you're the Nets and you're able to win game 3, a game before Kyrie Irving would inevitably get hurt. Well, maybe he wouldn't if they won. I don't know. But anyway, I'm just saying, if the Nets were up 3-0, this would have been a much different series. Teams don't really blow 3-0 leads. I don't know if it's ever happened before. Maybe it has. I don't remember any in my lifetime. But so yeah, I think the Nets, looking back on this series, game 3 is the one that got away. It's pretty much the best way to put it. But clearly the Nets need more depth. And I know the Dinwiddie injury was a problem. Even losing LaMarcus Aldridge, I know he was not in net to start the year, but LaMarcus Aldridge was the Nets starting 5. I mean, the guy had heart issues, so he had to, retire abruptly, which sucks for him. But having Blake Griffin, who ended up being a nice pickup. I mean, Blake Griffin's pickup was kind of a meme because people were like, oh, this guy can't dunk anymore. But Blake Griffin actually played some very good minutes for the Nets. He was arguably their 4th best player when all the guys were healthy. It's between him and Joe Harris. So, Blake Griffin actually played a nice role for this team. I do hope Blake Griffin is back for next year. He is a free agent. We'll do an offseason Nets video at some point, by the way. But I hope Blake Griffin's back next year. Even a guy like Bruce Brown, Sean Marks, who's an awesome GM. I think Sean Marks finished 3rd in the Executive of the Year voting, which, is not really what I thought was the case. I thought, he definitely deserved it, in my opinion, but I know the Nets got out in round 2, which is not good, but I think Sean Marks, from where he took over this team 5 years ago, where the Nets' second best player was like Sean Kilpatrick, to make this roster what it is now, it's a very unbelievable turnaround. And the Nets had, no draft picks for the next couple years when Marks took over. They belonged to Boston, of course, because of the KG and Pierce trade. So I think Sean Marks deserves some recognition at some point. Hopefully next year he can get it, or sometime in the near future. But anyway, even a guy like Jeff Green, who was a 1-year deal, 34 years old, not much was expected from Jeff Green. He was awesome all year. I know Jeff Green had the plantar fasciitis, which is a painful injury, but, through the regular season, he was dunking on guys. He was making his 3-pointers at a pretty high rate. He's a versatile defender, of course, and he has some ball handling ability. So Jeff Green was like the perfect guy for this Nets team. He kind of replaced Wilson Chandler of last year's team. Wilson Chandler was not a good net. So I was happy to see Jeff Green on this team. Hopefully he's back as well. Obviously, he could retire being 35 next year. We'll find out. But he said he wants to be in Brooklyn next year, so hopefully that's the case. But, even like a Landry Shamet, like there's just guys that just contributed throughout the season. Nick Claxton played some good defense when he was playing, but ultimately when the playoffs came around and these rotations kind of dwindled as the series went on, of course, even Bobby Portis for Milwaukee, who was a good player for them this year, I don't think he saw the floor in games 5, 6, or 7. So as the rosters and like the benches kind of dwindled down here, the Nets were down to a 6-man rotation, a 7-man rotation of just James Harden, Kevin Durant, I almost said Brook Lopez for some reason, Blake Griffin, Joe Harris, Landry Shamet, and Jeff Green, and I'm forgetting somebody else, but you get it. So the Nets had a very small rotation going on here of 7 guys, so it was kind of tough to get by with that, of course, but ultimately the Nets did not have enough firepower to get past Milwaukee. I mean, Kevin Durant was really the only superstar at full health, and he can only do so much. So, yeah, there was a lot on Kevin Durant's shoulders. He barely sat the final 3 games. I know he sat the final 6 minutes of game 6 because it was kind of a blowout at that point. But Kevin Durant played just about every minute of games 5 and game 7, maybe every minute exactly. He might have sat 1 minute, but still, he played just about every damn minute. So I give that guy a lot of credit, but the Nets definitely need some depth next year in some certain areas. Like, they need a veteran ball handler behind Kyrie Irving and James Harden just in case of injury, whether it's a George Hill, a Patty Mills, I have no idea, but just somebody to get in there, because having to rely on Mike James, who was overseas for half the year, wasn't even in the Brooklyn net for a while, relying on Chris Chiozza, who, yes, is a fine player, but has his limitations. Having to rely on those guys in a tough playoff series is not what you want. And Mike James, I think he had some nice games against the Celtics, but didn't do much at all this series. He was not really in the rotation most of the time. So, yeah, it was tough to see that. And they definitely could use some more length defensively. Specifically, guarding Giannis Antetokounmpo was a tough task for these guys. And Blake Griffin did about as well as he could, but Giannis from games 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 put up unbelievable numbers, and I think Giannis played better. Just, he was being more instinctive. He was taking smarter shots. I mean, of course, Giannis had some bad shot selections at some point. And by the way, I can't stand this 10-second free throw nonsense. Like, can these refs call it? I don't want to sound like the salty Nets fan, but like, if the rule's in place, can we try to at least call it maybe a few times? Like, I don't think Giannis shot a free throw within 10 seconds this entire series. So, yes, that kind of bothered me. It bothered James Harden, of course, because even he was like, what are we doing here? So, yeah, that was annoying to see. Obviously, I just wish the refs kind of enforced that rule, but that's pretty much, the refs were not that bad this series. Yes, I mean, of course, like any fan, I wish some calls went a different way, but it's not really the reason this team lost. And, yeah, let me address the elephant in the room, Joseph Harris. So, Joe Harris, I love the guy. I feel really bad for him and what happened this series because, Joe Harris is one of the OG Nets. He's been here since like 2017, I believe. He had the buzz cut. He came in just basically out of nowhere, the former Cavalier. I think he was cut by Orlando or something. The Nets get him out of nowhere. He becomes one of the, I don't know, like a key contributor to what the Nets had going on here. He was one of the Nets' best 5 players throughout the regular season, led the NBA in three-point percentage. I think he led the league or was top 2 in the league a couple years prior. So Joe Harris has a track record of being a very good shooter specifically. But Nets fans know Joe Harris does more than just shooting. But Joe Harris in the playoffs seemed very timid. He looked nervous. He looked pretty good against Boston. He had one really nice game against Boston. He scored like 20 points in the first quarter. It felt like one of those games. Might have been game number 2, I think it was. I'm pretty sure. But yeah, he scored like 20-something points or near there in the first quarter in one of those Boston games. But once game 3 happened in Milwaukee, Joe Harris turned into a different player. So that was very unfortunate to see. Is Joe Harris the main reason they lost this series? You can say that, but I do believe the number 1 reason they lost this series is because of the injuries. If you want to say Joe Harris is number 2, I can get on board with that because I do believe if Joe Harris made some of those 3-point attempts, they could have won this series. Game 3, he had a few attempts to make a big shot, didn't make it. Played terrible in games 5 and 6, and even 7 wasn't that good. And in game 7, because for some reason the Nets continued to insist on playing Joe Harris, Harris had a 3-point attempt, and I have it, somewhere in my photos because I cannot believe this happened. Joe Harris, it's actually my Twitter banner right now. Let me go look there because I think I deleted the photo. But Joe Harris had a 3-point attempt on the left wing, all alone, by the way. It was 111 with 59.4 left. If Joe Harris makes that 3-point shot, the Nets go up 114-111 with 59 seconds left, or 58 at that point, in overtime. So, yeah, the Nets might win if Joe Harris can make that shot, which kind of goes as a forgotten moment. People want to focus on the KD air ball. I get it. But, yeah, Joe Harris missed a big shot in that game. But, yeah, I mean, look, I don't know if Joe Harris is going to get traded. I know Sean Marks, the Nets GM, and Steve Nash spoke to the media today. They didn't completely rule it out that Joe Harris could be traded. I think Sean Marks says there's going to be inevitable changes to this roster. We all know that. How big are those changes, we'll find out. But what I want to know is what team is going to take Joe Harris's contract of like 3 years and like $55 million left. I don't know many teams that are taking that contract. So the Nets might have to stick it out. And look, I still have faith in Joe Harris. The guy's not this bad. I've watched this guy play for 3.5, 4 years now, every game. Joe Harris is not that player. I don't know what happened. I don't know if the pressure got to him, if it was mental, but whatever happened, that's not who Joe Harris is. He's a much better player than that. The Nets will not give him $70 million for no reason. So I do want to believe Joe Harris bounces back. But if the Nets see a deal in the offseason where they could trade Joe Harris for a different player, I've heard Miles Turner's name thrown out there for some reason. Miles Turner would be a nice fit for the Nets, honestly, a rim protector, make some perimeter shots if he needs to. But, something like that, I could see that one happening maybe. But then once again, why would the Pacers do that? I have no idea. So, yeah, we'll find out what happens in the offseason. There's plenty of time for that. But that's pretty much all I got. It's disappointing. It sucks because, once again, it was expectations. When your expectations are very high and they are not met, it is very tough to deal with. Like for the Giants, for instance. Of course, I'm a Giants fan. The last 3 years, I expected the Giants to win 6 games, 7 games, and 7. I think I had it in that order, something like that. But I obviously had low expectations for the Giants. So when the Giants finished down there, Yes, it sucked because I want to make the playoffs, of course, but when the Giants had bad records, it's kind of easier to live with because it's like, okay, the expectations were low. It is what it is. We get the draft coming up, okay. But when your expectations are win the finals or win the Super Bowl, or make a deep playoff run, and they are not met, that's when it gets tough. So as a Giants fan this year, I think the Giants have had good off seasons the past couple of years. If they don't make the playoffs this year, that's disappointing. I will be disappointed because, I do feel the Giants should be right on the cusp of making the playoffs. So we'll find out, but that's, for football season. But anyway, that'll do it. Leave in the comments how you feel about the Nets season. Try not to overreact about Joe Harris. I mean, don't trade him for nothing. Don't release him. But, I'm sure some fans have strong opinions about him, but that's pretty much it. I did not know the Nets were this hated by people either. I've seen it all over Twitter. Some people on social media just hate the Nets and wanted them to fail very badly, which I get. Hey, look, it's listed as the quote-unquote super team. I know a lot of Knicks fans hate the Nets. Fine, I get it. I'm not going to sit here and roast the Knicks, although I could. So, I'll play nice, and it is what it is. We're both losers at the end of the day. So, I do genuinely believe, though, the Nets will be back next year. I think they'll be a better team next year. Of course, it all depends on health, which I cannot predict. But I do believe this Nets team will be a very good team for the next 3 or 4 years. I know some people speculate, oh, what if Kevin Durant leaves after next year? What if James Harden leaves after next year? I'm not fully buying into that. I think there's a reason these guys signed in Brooklyn. Kevin Durant has quotes about loving being here, wants to be on the East Coast. Kyrie Irving grew up a New Jersey Nets fan. James Harden seems to like the atmosphere as well. Not many players who leave this organization have bad things to say. I feel like everyone that plays for this team, they love the coaches, they love the atmosphere, they love the fans, they love like this. I mean, Kevin Durant, for instance, says he likes the Nets because they're more of like a low-key type team, not like big and flashy like the Knicks, of course, and their fan base. And, they're the color black. They kind of just like don't stick out or anything like that. So I do believe, and I could be wrong, of course, a lot changes. I do believe Harden, KD, and Kyrie are here for the long haul. Whether that's 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 5+, I have no idea. I do believe these guys will be here for a while. I don't see that changing anytime soon. If they leave after next year, that would suck. I would be devastated, but I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but that's how I genuinely feel right now, so we'll find out. But hopefully we can look back on this next year and say, damn, that Milwaukee series sucked, but it made the Nets better for the future. So hopefully next year they find a way to actually get it done, make the finals, and handle business. We'll find out how it goes. But it all depends on health, which is scary. And I knew that the whole time. I had people, people I'm friends with and people at work were telling me, after the Nets were up game 2, they're like, yo, Mike, you must be so excited. I'm like, yeah, I'm excited, but the Nets are an injury away from being like, an average team. And what do you know? Kyrie Irving twists his ankle. So I had like those tempered expectations. I always try not to get too ahead of myself because once again, they were a Kyrie Irving or a Kevin Durant injury away from being this average team that was overwhelmed by a good Milwaukee roster. So that's why I was trying not to get ahead of myself. And what do you know what happens? So it sucks. It is what it is. And I feel bad for the real Nets fans out there, the people that were, with them before all the big trades and the KD acquisition happened and all that. But, it is what it is. Hopefully they come back in the future and are much better and find a way to win a title. But that was not meant to be in this 2020/2021 season. So it is what it is. That's the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. But anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Leave in the comments how you feel about this Nets season. If you want any Nets content in the future for this offseason, let me know, and I'll talk to you guys next time.